Welcome to On the Front Lines. Today we are with Professor Jayati Ghosh, who's Professor of Economics at Jawaharlal Nehru University. And we are streaming live on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, and Twitch. We also have Martha from Signable, who's going to translate this into sign language as we talk. Thank you, Professor Ghosh, for joining us.
It's a pleasure, Rishabh.
Thank you. So it's been a little over a month that we've been in lockdown in India. And globally, it's been the epidemiologists versus the economists, one advocating totally for a lockdown, and the economists saying that, lives and livelihoods both are important. It seems that the epidemiologists have 1-0 right now. What's your take on that?
Well, Rishabh, to be honest, I think both of these are false dichotomies that we are being fed by the media. There are many epidemiologists who are saying that, in fact, the lockdown pattern is far too strong for countries like India, and that there are many ways to go to control the pandemic, of which the lockdown is the final and last measure. So, including our own Indian epidemiologists and people in England, people in the US, many have actually argued that the science is still very uncertain on all this. And we cannot actually be very, very confident about what measures to take. So I think even in epidemiology, there are two sides. Second, this whole lives versus livelihoods, that's completely false. What we're doing in India is killing many, many people because of the lockdown. Killing them, actually, through hunger, through desperation, people, being killed in road accidents as they're dying desperately to go home. People so enervated and weakened by the lack of nutrition that they're experiencing over this month and possibly the next month, that they will be in no condition to combat any disease, not COVID-19, but not malaria, not typhoid, not cholera, not any disease. So I think, it's wrong to say that this is lives versus livelihood. It's not just that. It's really about how do you save lives and what is the least brutal way of saving lives.
As we enter the last phase of this lockdown, many are predicting lockdown 3.0, and often it seems like this is the way the political leadership wants to go. What do you think? I know 4 weeks ago when you were on a show with Karan Thapar, you used the phrase "falling from a cliff." Yes. Do you think we are now deep in the sea?
Yes, it's actually very, very unfortunate what has happened. And, I have to tell you that even when I was talking to Karan Thapar, in my wildest dreams, I did not imagine that the government would do so little to prevent this catastrophe. I thought that they would do something, not enough, but that they would do something. What is unbelievable to me is how little they have done. So, first of all, I think we have to remember that the Indian lockdown is the most extreme in the world. There is no country that has done it as severely, as completely, and with so many restrictions. There is no country that did it with so little notice. Not the developed countries, but not even our neighbors, not Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, nobody did it like this with 4 hours notice, and then stopping all transport, stopping all ability of people to get where they could be to get through this period of lockdown. So we were the most extreme, and I would say the most brutal. Then we are the country in the world with the largest proportion of informality. 95% of our workers don't have formal contracts, don't have any social protection, cannot be sure of their work employment from the next week even. And so to do that in a country like this is actually unthinkable. Even in countries where 70-80% of the workers are formal, there are many, many complaints about people having to experience difficulties in this period. We are doing it to 95% of our workers. It's extraordinary. The second feature of this, which is like unbelievable, is that having done this, So let's think of it logically. If someone came from Mars and landed in India and was told that because of a public health issue, because of concerns of people's health, they have told everybody to stay at home, they have stopped all economic activity, they have prevented people from getting their employment, they've prevented people from getting any income, fine, for public health purposes. The person from Mars would naturally, well, the whatever being from Mars would expect that the government is giving something in return to enable people to get through that period. You cannot tell people, I will not allow you to work or earn a living, but I will not give you anything for you to survive in this period either. This, again, it's unthinkable, right? But this is what has happened. They have prevented us from doing anything, from working, from earning incomes. Daily wage laborers are deprived. People are thrown out of their workspaces because often those are also where they live. And then they're told, okay, we will not pay you, we will not cover your livelihood, we will not even give you anything to eat in most cases, and we will not allow you to get home. We will prevent you, we will beat you on the roads with lathis if we find you trying to walk home. We will stop all transport. We will douse you with terrible chemicals. We will treat you like criminals. We will lock you up in detention centers if you try and get home. So you can starve to death where you are. Now, then they will say, oh, we're not starving you to death, we are giving you food. That's the other unbelievable thing. I keep getting asked by foreign journalists, why is India not releasing the food grain? You say you have surplus food grain, why aren't you releasing it? I have no answer. I cannot understand why they are sitting on 75 million tons of food grain by their own estimation, when the buffer stock norm is 24 million tons. That's 51 tons, million tons extra. And they're doing the Rabi procurement, which means they're going to collect another 30, 40 million tons. What are they thinking? Just give it away free. It costs the government 5 rupees 60 paisa per kilogram just to store this grain. So they are spending about 18, 20,000 just storing this grain. Release it, for heaven's sake. Release it, allow people free access to food so they do not starve to death. And do not ask for a ration card or this or that. Just give it to whoever wants. Use indelible ink, like we use for elections or something like that, so that every person gets their 5 kilos or 10 kilos this month. Just use that now. If this is not an emergency, what is? And as I said, the minimum thing you should do is compensate people for the livelihood they have lost. So at least provide some income transfer, some cash transfer to people, because you are not allowing them to earn. It's not that they have willingly said, we are just going to stay at home and, out of fear. They have done it because you have told them they have to do it. So you have to give them something to survive.
So there are a couple of interesting points that you're making, that it almost sounds like nothing has happened in the last 4 weeks. Pretty much between the lockdown and now, things have remained as they are in some animated suspension. But the government did announce a large package of 1 lakh crore plus, and a 15,000 crore package in between for medical and health related situations. What has happened to those packages? What were those packages about?
So you see, again, Rishabh, the idea that it was large is a complete lie fed to us by the media. It was not large. It's a pathetically small package. 15,000 crore for a country the size of India for all the medical preparation. So, by the way, that money is spread over 3 years. So a small part of that is now being given to states. They're getting, 100 crore here, 120 crore here. That's what is happening. So half of it this year, 15,000, it's not the, it's not all for this year. 50,000 crore, half of which will come this year in little dribbles. And the next part will come over the next 2 years. Can you imagine? So first of all, that's the first point. It's tiny little amounts. The state governments are saying we can barely even buy testing kits with the money we're getting. It's a joke, right? What they have given. Second thing, the other fiscal stimulus package that Ms. Sitaraman announced. Much of that is already existing spending. They just actually took what they were going to spend anyway, what they have anyway promised, like PM Kisan was due in April, they put that in their stimulus package. So if you remove all the spending that already existed, you're getting not more than 70, 80,000 crore, which is less than 0.5% of GDP, less than half a percentage point of GDP. That is the stimulus package for an economy that's falling off the cliff, as we've said, which is now in the sea. Yes. So think of this not just in relation to the size of the challenge and the problem which the government itself created. but also in relation to what other governments are doing. Across the world, governments are spending between 5 and 20% of GDP. Okay, 100 times to 400 times what we are spending. I mean, actually, in relation to GDP. Okay, the smaller packages are about 5%. The medium-sized packages are the US, which already just spent 11% and has just announced another package of 5%. So 16% in US. Japan, 20%. I mean, everywhere you go, governments are spending money. And then you will say, how do they afford it? They're telling the central bank, you just give us the money. So you can do it. It can be done. It's being done as we speak across the world, also in other developing countries. So again, it's a complete surprise. Why is this government not doing it? What is stopping them? Is it fear of capital flight? Well, capital's already flying, right? And the more the economy tanks, the more capital will leave. You can put in controls to prevent capital from moving for the next 3 months. Many countries are thinking of that. But that's not, I mean, that cannot stop you. You're a big economy. You have such a large proportion of the global population. You think you are a global leader, you're emerging, you're going to compete with China. I mean, you're making all these claims and you're not even willing to spend a minimum amount. I mean, the minimum stimulus would be 5% of GDP, the minimum, just to do the things that I've mentioned, you know, basic health provision and proper basic healthcare provision, spending on making sure food reaches everybody, providing 3 months at half the minimum wage to 80% of households. That would cost you 5% of GDP. But that's what you owe the people because you have done this to the people. I should also mention, you know, I said that the economy would decline. I heard yesterday from people who are associated with studies being done by the NCAER and the NIPFP that they are finding that the current quarter, the economy is falling by as much as 30%. 30% decline in this quarter. And so the annual rate of growth or rate of whatever in this economy would be a decline of anything more of 15% plus. Now that's not, as you said, that's we're in the sea. We are no longer falling off the cliff.
The IMF some weeks ago said that India and China would be the only economies in the world that will continue to grow once we are, past this pandemic. And here we are in some sort of a gloomy situation where you're saying that, we're going to face a certain decline. What is your view on this?
Well, I mean, nobody can believe those IMF estimates. I have talked to IMF economists and World Bank economists who simply cannot believe those estimates. So I'm not really sure what drove that particular projection for India. Certainly the China possibility is greater because China has already recovered. They've restarted factory production. They've started, they're back on track as an economy. They've got over the worst, yes? In India, we are beginning the decline. We also had the biggest lockdown, much, much bigger than China. We have done nothing to compensate for that lockdown. So private demand is collapsing, household consumption is collapsing, investment is collapsing, and the government is also spending less, right? So there is nothing that will enable a revival. The IMF model, I really don't know what makes it tick. I'm not sure. I do know the UN model, which was also in the news the other day, which basically said 1% rate of growth for India over this year. And that is entirely because that UN model did not factor in such a long lockdown. And because they have a model which assumes that any fall in the global price rise is a positive impact on India. So because global oil has fallen so sharply, they said, okay, therefore India benefits. But that's based on an unreal assumption that we didn't lock down for so long and destroy economic activity for 2 months.
And you also made a very significant point that nothing has reached the poor so far. But in the last 6 years, one of the biggest infrastructures that's been spoken about is the JAM Trinity, which essentially says that, we've mapped out all the poor and social security is much more stronger now. Despite this, of course, there are reports in the Hindu that 96% of the people who are stranded have not received anything. Why has this infrastructure not been effective in delivering to the poor?
So, here's the thing. I am not a big fan of jam, particularly because I don't think the biometric based identity is the best way to go, especially now when it's also a health hazard to be using biometrics. But I will say that again, and a surprise has been that, okay, if you have created this, why on earth aren't you using it? Exactly as you said. Just like, you have all these food grade stocks, for God's sake, at least give it to the state governments. Minimum, at least give, they haven't even given that 5 kilogram free per person that they promised. They haven't even given 30% of that 1 month later. So why are you not using the jam trinity so-called? I have no idea. I cannot, there is no logical or even political economy reason to do this. And unless you would have a kind of degree of cruelty and sadism that I cannot imagine any democratic government having, why would you allow so much of your population to suffer without doing even the minimum that allows them to kind of just survive over this period? It's impossible to understand.
You also made the point about ration, delivering ration to the poor, and the fact that we have such excess, stock of grain.
Yeah.
There were several articles which said that this is due to the accounting methods that we have in India, and that I think John Reyes wrote an article saying that this would affect the ratings of the countries, and there's a problem on that end. Do you think that's a real problem, or
no? I don't think Jean said that this would affect. I mean, I don't think that would be his argument. I think, look, it's possible that India wants to show that we're still fiscally prudent. Okay, but here's the thing: nobody else in the world is being fiscally prudent. Everybody realizes this is an unprecedented challenge. This is something that is a once in a lifetime. Certainly in my lifetime, it's the biggest thing that has ever happened. And governments are responding in that way. These are not normal times. These are extraordinary times. The Indian government seems to think that if they remain fiscally prudent, then global investors will love us. They will not love us if our economy has sunk, if we're down there at the bottom of the sea. They will not love us. They don't care. Right? They would want to see an economy that is growing. If you do nothing and you say, but look, we've been fiscally prudent, so what?
Right. So we've just ended the Rabi season, and so far there's been no news of lack of purchase of grains. That supply chain has still sort of existed or survived or has been revitalized. Do you think this will not impact the Kharif crop? Do you think that we will have a normal agricultural season in the Kharif season?
So first of all, I should mention that yes, Rabi procurement, I think all the state governments have been very anxious to procure as much as possible. But public procurement is only a small proportion of total output. Please bear that in mind. And farmers are having great difficulty selling the rest of the crop. And in many states, procurement operations reach a very small proportion. It often comes late. They often leave within a few days. Farmers are finding it very difficult to get to the mandis or get to the procurement points. There are many, many cases coming up of farmers who are simply unable to get their produce to the places where they could actually sell. So it's not the case that because public procurement is actually being positive and meeting targets, even exceeding targets, that the rest of the produce is being able to be sold easily. So even with wheat, farmers are selling at well below the MSP in the open market. And of course, don't even talk about horticulture. That has been so badly affected. Horticulture, vegetables, fruits, I mean, all other kinds of cash crops have been hugely affected by this, by the failure of logistics and the marketing infrastructure, which is also because the lockdown was poorly implemented. People didn't, there was confusion, local police didn't allow these trucks to move, the mandis were not open for a long time, and so on. So for many reasons, farmers are really finding it difficult to sell their crops. Even dairy, there's a collapse in dairy. So farmers are selling, or livestock breeders are selling at 20% of the price. Even Mother Dairy has reduced its procurement price by 10 rupees per liter, whereas they keep the market price the same. Remember, dairy, about 20% of dairy and other horticulture was actually met by the restaurant industry, hospitality industry. restaurants, hotels, and so on. That's gone, right? That doesn't exist. The rest of the 80%, there are also logistic difficulties. So farmers are really suffering. They are being squeezed like anything. What does this mean for their kharif crop? This is a complex question. Maybe farmers, a lot of them will think, let's just, at least ensure our own sustenance. So we do a lot of our own subsistence farming rather than only for the market. Maybe the loss of trust in the available system will mean that a lot will have to be done to ensure adequate sowing of the kinds of crops we need. I don't think there has been any systematic planning about how do we ensure the minimum necessities over time. It's kind of a free for all. It's as if you allow it, the market will deliver and farmers will all start producing all the things we need and everything will get delivered automatically. It doesn't work that way. Farmers also need inputs. They also need machinery and those have to be repaired. They need pesticides, they need fertilizer, they need seeds. Those have to be easily available. And then the marketing process, the food processing, the marketing, all of that has to be available. All of those require inputs. Somebody has to sit there and work all of this out and make sure that all that coordination is happening. In other words, central and state governments, different departments of different ministries all have to sit together and plan this out. I know this government thinks planning is a bad word, but if you don't plan now, you are going to face supply shortages in the future. Right now, it's okay because we just had a harvest, but you have to ensure for the future.
So you made a very interesting point about the fact that the entire world is talking about stimulus, is the entire world is going towards, sort of thinking in ways in which it can revive demand. In India, very recently, we had a paper called Force being submitted to the CBDT. What was that paper about? And largely the public perception about that paper was that it was about taxing the rich. So what was that about?
This is about the bunch of young Indian Revenue Service officers who had given a set of proposals to the government. So here's the thing. Right now, basically, the only way to do it is to print money, right? Governments across the world are doing this. You borrow from the central bank, which is called monetized deficit. You print money and you spend. And that is the only way to deal with the current crisis. But obviously, it is not what you can keep doing forever. You have to do it now, the next 3-6 months. But over time, you have to also generate your own resources, yes? Now, two things here. One is if you don't spend, your GDP will fall further and your tax revenues will fall further. So you will end up with a large deficit anyway. So you have to spend right now. But over time, you also have to think of new ways of raising revenue. And one area, which I think that paper made a good point, is that we have massively undertaxed the rich. Okay, so calls for a wealth tax and a large higher tax on the top income bracket. These calls are also global now. They're happening in the US, they're happening in Europe, even South Africa. There was a paper yesterday. And in fact, the government of in South Africa is seriously considering this. So across the world, people are saying, listen, we have allowed multinational companies to get away with no tax practically, effectively. We have allowed the rich not to pay a tax on their wealth. We have allowed the very people who get an income above 1,000 crore every year not to be taxed. So this is actually making very reasonable proposals. It's asking for a small wealth tax. I think it was only 2%. And it is asking for a raise in the marginal tax rate for people with an income above 1,000 crore a year. Let me repeat that. Your annual income is above 1,000 crore a year. That's all. So all they're saying is for that group, just raise the marginal rate of tax. Is that such a big deal? No. So, this massive outcry and, oh my God, it's a tax terrorism. This is ridiculous. These are reasonably sensible proposals.
There was also a proposal to raise tax slabs on anyone who makes over 10 lakhs a year in that paper.
Yeah, that I think is excessive. Right now, look, I would put it this way. Right now is not a time to raise taxes in general, okay? Because everybody's income is falling. The poor are the most devastated, and those who are informal workers, they're the worst affected, but everyone is suffering. Small industry is suffering, medium enterprises are suffering, everyone's suffering. So I would not say that this is the moment to raise tax rates, except for the very, very rich. Okay. So a wealth tax, there was one paper that said that if you just tax the richest, what was it, 960 individuals. Okay, that's not a large number. And a small wealth tax on them, which they would not even notice. Yeah, you get 1% of GDP on that. So I do not believe that you should tax, have a very large tax net at this point. Just focus on the extremely rich, the obscenely rich, the 0.001% of your population.
Even in these tough times and this situation where we see, so many people suffering, we still have instances of corruption coming up, and instances of I don't have a word for it, but there are two things that I read that really bothered me. One was the case of the testing kits, where we procured them for a certain price, but we had almost a triple markup on the price being sold to the state.
Yes.
And the other instance that I read was of a 68,000 crore write-off by the RBI for the top 50 willful defaulters.
Yes.
What are both of these seemingly different, have similar threads going across them. One can clearly be called corruption, but the other, I don't know what to call it. What is your take on that?
So, the problem is that in a sense, what we've done is legalized corruption. Ever since we allowed electoral bonds to happen. And I would say that the Supreme Court allowed it because the Supreme Court actually said that it's all right. That is legalized corruption because it enables the government, the government knows who is buying the electoral bonds, to actually do quid pro quos in a completely legal way. Now, I don't know enough about many other cases. There have been all kinds of allegations about defense deals and this and that. But what is certainly true is that that has opened the way to very, very legalized corruption. So supposing you have this markup, this very significant markup in the testing kits that you were talking about, and it's a central government decision, right? Somebody is pocketing that difference. And maybe that company is buying a lot of electoral bonds. We have no way of knowing. Similarly, the RBI is letting off a number of capitalists. Yeah. Now, let's face it, whether you like it or not, the RBI is also an agent of the state. The RBI could have not written that off. They could have instead said, we will write off 68,000 crore of the debt of state governments who are in desperate straits, who desperately need money, who don't even get last year's dues from the central government of GST. So the RBI could have said, we will write off the debts of the state governments. Similarly, the RBI has just put in a rescue package for mutual funds institutions. Ever since the Franklin Templeton case, where there was a lot of investors leaving and so on. So for confidence in the mutual fund industry, now let's face it, it's only upper middle class and above who are in the mutual fund game. For confidence, they have provided, 60,000 crore or 50,000 crore, very large bailout, right? Again, they could have done that for state governments. Actually, state governments today need purchase of their debt up to 500,000 crore, I would say. So the RBI could have done this. It doesn't do that. It does these very selective things which favor a few individuals and do nothing for the economy. Because look at this, if they had actually written off the debts of state governments, they could go out there, borrow more, and actually spend on the people. They are the ones doing all the heavy lifting today in terms of everything that needs to be done, whether it is healthcare or dealing with the COVID or the employment or food or all the welfare measures are being handled by the state governments. The central government is all they are doing is sending policemen to different states and saying ye nahi kar rahe wo nahi kar rahe ho. Danda, basically. Yeah, they are not providing them any money. They're not even giving them what the state governments are due, from last year. And then they are telling the RBI, go and save these crony capitalists. Do not save the state governments. As I said, if somebody came from Mars and saw this, they would not be able to believe it, that this could happen in a democracy.
So, a constant theme has been, and we've been speaking to several people who are working on the ground, with activists, with people who are working with children and migrant labor. And the common theme that emerges everywhere is that the state governments don't have money.
Yes.
I remember someone telling me that इनके पास पैसा ही नहीं है, they are dependent on us. It sounds dystopian. It sounds weird, awkward that a state government wouldn't have money to run. I mean, last year we heard the Delhi government was a surplus government, and anecdotally we heard conversations that the Delhi government will run out of cash this week.
Yes.
So what is this about?
So I have, in fact, just been part of a webinar organized by the state government of Kerala, in which a number of finance ministers of different states had also attended, and were talking about precisely this issue, about how they genuinely do not have money. And Manish Sisodia mentioned that their GST collections, which used to be, let's say, 3,500 crore, now 350 crore, 300 crore. That kind of collapse in GST revenues. So there's no money from GST. Delhi was one of the richest states. Delhi was a very, in a very advantageous position because of various things. Delhi has always been lucky. This is happening to Delhi. Imagine what is happening to other states. And pretty much all the finance minister who were present, I think there was Punjab, there was Maharashtra, there was Kerala, of course, all of them said that their GST collections are down to 1/10 of what they were. So that's the first. They just don't have money, right? Their own collect. Second, the central government owes them 30,000 crore from last year, which they're just not paying. Not paying. That's it. Won't pay. Okay. So at least from last year's revenue, give them right now. Why is this a problem for the state governments? Because unlike the central government, they have a hard budget constraint. They're allowed something called ways and means allowances, which is literally a small amount that you can spend over what you have as cash in the bank. But if they spend even a little bit more than that, their checks bounce. And finance minister after finance minister was saying, by next week, I will not be able to pay salaries even of health workers. So we are talking about that kind of collapse in revenues. So then this was raised, I'm told, in the meeting that the Prime Minister had with chief ministers yesterday, where, as you know, not everyone is even allowed to speak. Designated 7 chief ministers were allowed to speak. One of them raised this issue about resources and said, we absolutely cannot manage. We desperately need resources. What are you going to do about ensuring we have resources? There was no answer.
When GST came, a little while back, it was hailed as a great moment in the Republic, and one of the last vestiges of federalism, so to say, was handed over to the center. It made the center even more powerful than it ever was in the history of the independent republic.
Yeah.
Do you, in hindsight, feel that this was a miscalculation politically, economically, and why is this? I mean, apart from while you say that there is no reason why there's no explanation for the center not giving this to the states, can you even is there any reasonable guess that one can make that as to why this is not happening?
Okay, so these are 2 different questions. On GST, I have to tell you, I was one of those who opposed it from the beginning. In fact, some of us were even thinking of bringing in a public interest litigation because it is anti-federal, because it is fundamentally opposed, I would say, even to the spirit of the Constitution, which allows the center and the states different powers and responsibilities. And therefore, states do need to be able to have some revenue-raising capacities of their own. So I felt it was excessively centralizing and anti-federal, and that certainly has been established. But also remember, this has been the most centralizing government we have ever experienced. I mean, I was around, I was a student during Indira Gandhi's years, and let me tell you, that was a walk in the park compared to what we have now. We really have a very, very centralizing force in the government. And it is one that is using every possible legal means, including the Disaster Management Act, including all kinds of things that we hadn't even thought about. They are using every element of those to concentrate power in their hands, reduce the power of the state governments, but leave all the work to the state governments. So it's that appalling contradiction where they have all the power, but the state governments have to do all the work, and they are the ones responsible to the people. They are the ones facing the heat on the ground. That, I think, is something which is so devastating for India as we know it that it could even eventually undo the country. I don't think India can survive for very long as one centralized power. Those very centralizing empires ended up not surviving in different ways. Yes, and I think that's a real danger here. Not now, maybe not in my lifetime, but eventually it would actually sow very, very divisive seeds. The other question, I think, your other question was about. Sorry, you asked two questions, and one of them was I answered.
So the other question was that while we can only guess why the center is not releasing the GST money it owes to the centers. I mean, we have the Punjab chief minister threatening to go to court with this.
Yes.
Can we even guesstimate why such a thing, why such an event is unfolding?
Rishabh, frankly, so many things are happening now that I would have thought are unthinkable. I would have thought it unthinkable that you're sitting on 75 million tons of food grain and you're not distributing free. Okay, I would have thought it unthinkable that a government can impose a lockdown, that is, cut economic activity, demand and supply, both cut, okay, for more than a month. Now, I think it's going to be 2 months without any compensation to people. All of these are unthinkable. I would have thought it unthinkable that if a government has signed a solemn treaty with state governments, that was the basis of GST, that they will get this compensation over 5 years, that they would simply say, no, we won't give it to you. Many things that I thought were unthinkable are now happening. What is the most unthinkable to me, to be quite honest, is that all of this is accepted. That in mainstream media, you do not get any noise about this. People in general don't even know about this. Most people in most states think that it's their state government that is not providing things. People do not even seem aware of the enormity of what is happening. And when they do, they somehow seem to think it's all right. That, we can bang pots on balconies and we can light diyas and things will be all right. We trust our supreme leader and we don't need to do anything more.
At this point, I'd like to tell our viewers that they can start putting in their questions in the comments on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, and we'd be happy to put them across to Professor Ghosh. So, Professor Ghosh, with so many migrant workers stuck or inclined to go back to their home states, how do you imagine the future is going to unfold with respect to this category of society? Because our cities, our lives are dependent on the labor that these people put in. Will they ever feel like coming back to these cities where they've been made to feel so unwelcome? What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, this one again, it's a complicated thing. And to be honest, I mean, look, I don't understand social psychology. I don't understand what makes people tick. So, all of that, I don't know. But certainly in the near future, migrants, there is such a betrayal of trust. What have you done to migrants? You have basically told migrant workers, you've basically told them, at any moment, without any notice, 4 hours notice, I can deprive you of your livelihood, your occupation. I do not feel any need to ensure that you then have a roof over your head, are able to survive with enough food, that your children will have milk to drink, etc. I won't bother with any of that. I can do what I like with you, and I can stop you from going home. I mean, imagine that's the biggest kind of threat of all. In other words, I will basically create a prison for you wherever you have gone to work, where you will have no choice even to get back home. Now, I think that's last one is really the worst and most deadly thing, because people will say, look, okay, here we don't have food, we don't have work, but we'll all die together. We will be with each other. I will be with my family. I will be able to look after my elderly parents. I will not be in this distant place alone and starve to death and not even know how they are. So I think that betrayal of trust that we have done, this is going to take a while for it to recover. Now, it may well be that conditions will become so bad even in the rural areas that people will still move. But, it's going to be definitely a much more uneasy situation.
In 1991, when we liberalized, and the years after that, Inequality has reached massive proportions. Uh, Yet, several people, industrialists have made wealth, large enterprises have flourished. And we now have a situation where Bajaj and Rajiv Bajaj, specifically from Bajaj Auto, said that we're happy to go back to Inspector Raj. We're happy if you come and inspect us, check us, but let us open our shops. Do you think that the economic model that we adopted in 91, and for whatever time it worked, but now it's time to look at something else?
Mm. Look, I mean, I have been a critic of the whole, neoliberal approach to the economy because I think it relies too much on what is called trickle down. Yeah, the whole idea is that you basically incentivize big capital and they will deliver for you. Now, what has happened is that yes, they delivered aggregate growth, but they got 90% of the benefits of that growth. So over this 30-year period, when India emerged as this major booming economy, the beneficiaries are maybe the top 20% of the population, including you and I and so on, the middle classes. But 80% of the population didn't really benefit. And many of them have got more insecure, more desperate lives. We didn't actually improve the basics of people's lives: food, health, education, and the things that matter. We didn't actually improve those conditions. And to me, that's the real development failure. And I think it's important that the neoliberal period is not just that it was very, very unequal, but that inequality occurs in a situation where the bottom half is not better off. So you see, in China was also very unequal. China also, inequality grew massively, but the bottom half also got better off. That's a very big difference. We still have extreme destitution, extreme poverty, and I would say that we are forcing at least half our population to live lives that are not only insecure and fragile, but lack dignity. And that's a very, very big difference and a very major development failure. So yes, I do feel that if we had embarked on a different route, one that actually recognized that the basic needs of the population have to be fulfilled, with some degree of liberalization. I'm not against liberalization in general, but in a managed way, so that you're ensuring employment and you're ensuring the basic needs of people. Then it would have been a different story.
India's middle classes have been, credited with the rise of the current political dispensation, the aspirations of the middle class. In some ways, it also feels like the lockdown and the continuation of the lockdown, the middle classes are largely comfortable with it. Do you think this current situation will not have long-term impacts on the middle classes? I mean, have the middle classes not realized what is really happening?
Yeah, I think first of all, if I may be frank, I think there's a lot of stupidity in the middle classes at the moment. Okay, there's but also let's be clear. The way this lockdown is being implemented, it feeds into a lot of middle class and upper caste prejudices. Okay, there's this whole social distancing. I mean, come on, we are the global experts in social distancing, right? That's what caste was all about. The whole idea of some people being unclean, anybody who's infected, the stigma associated with an infection, the whole idea that you can protect yourself vis-a-vis everybody else. All of these are prejudices that existed, and they can have been brought out and given lots more air, shall we say, by the way that so-called social distancing is being used in India. That's why, for example, in Kerala, they say physical distancing, social solidarity. It's a very different thing, because what people are asked to be doing is keep a physical distance, but not social. Whereas, the way we've implemented it in most of the country is a very socially distant thing. Now, here's the thing about this particular lockdown, is that right now, middle classes are fine. I mean, let's face it, I'm comfortable. I happen to be a salaried person. I'm still getting my salary. I'm living comfortably in my home. I'm getting access to, my basic needs. There's no problem. And the worst problem is that I am unable to access a paid domestic worker, so I have to do my own domestic work. Big deal. That's about it, right? So the middle classes are just fine right now. But when we come out of this, and it's not as if, you end the lockdown on whichever date, say 15th May, and then on 16th May, everybody just gets up, dusts themselves off, and walks on as if it was just the same. It will not be the same. This will be a dead economy. Jobs are not going to come back like that. Many, many, many small and medium enterprises will be dead. They're over. They will never recover. They will close. They will not find demand. Employment across the board is going to be just a nightmare. We are told by CMIE that already 180 million people have lost their jobs. 180 million people have lost their jobs, 18 crore people. So we are talking about very, very large economic devastation, which will inevitably affect the middle class. And particularly, I think, which is why, even the epidemiologists say this, that look, even globally, there's this big issue. If anything, the conflict is largely a generational conflict. We know that the elderly are disproportionately prone and disproportionately likely to die of this. Even then, the rates are low, right? The majority will survive, but let's say in some countries, even 30% of those above 80 have died. But more and more, it's the elderly who are more likely to die. The young are largely either immune or will be, non-symptomatic carriers, or even if they get it, they will not actually perish from it. What are we doing? We are saving some elderly at the cost of a generation. I think the middle class doesn't realize this. They don't realize what this is doing to the educational and employment prospects of their own children. We are actually destroying a generation.
That's a big statement.
Yes, it is, and I wish I didn't have to make it. I really wish, because I have students, I have a daughter, I really wish I didn't have to say this.
We have a bunch of questions coming in from the audience. Govind Manoharan asks that, could you please talk about the measures directed at government employees salaried on the central level and state level in the context of the state's cash crunch that you mentioned? I think the question specifically says that, do you think government employees how long will they remain safe from this?
They're not safe. Telangana has already cut salaries. Some states like Kerala doesn't want to cut salaries, but it's deferring payment. So they're saying 20% of payment you will get afterwards, because they have no choice. They literally have no money, as I told you. And if this continues, and if the economy doesn't revive, they are not going to have money for a while. So they will have no option but to actually cut salaries and employment. And remember, something like 30%, 40% of government employment is ad hoc. It's not, it's outsourced or it's indirect, and they're not proper contracts. So those people will already have lost their livelihoods. Okay, so yes, that's definitely the case.
During this entire series, when we've had people come in, one of the concepts that's been spoken about is solidarity. That this is not a problem that can be solved via 2% CSR. This is not a problem that can be solved via employment, and this is not a problem that the government only or civil society only can solve. How would you, let's say in economic terms, define solidarity? What could we do to come together as a society to help revive some way of life, given that right now pretty much everything's non-existent?
So, look, I think solidarity is essential, and I think solidarity will, you cannot build something out of the ruins of this without massive solidarity. Which is why, as I said, the Kerala model, public, physical distancing, social solidarity is such an important one. But I want to repeat this. Even solidarity among citizens is not going to work, or we can't even say citizens anymore, among people, is not going to work until the government spends more money. Individuals cannot do this. Individuals, even in groups, cannot do this. We cannot revive the economy on our own. There has to be a demand stimulus. You can't tell people, let's say an entire cluster of settlements who have all lost their livelihood, that okay, you be solidarity, have some solidarity with each other. Sure, they will, but they've all lost their income. Somebody has to inject the demand. The only agency in the country that can inject demand is the state, which is why I'm saying the state has to spend more. central government, state governments. The RBI should be offering to completely bankroll the state governments right now, buy the debt of the state governments, give them debt relief, and enable them to spend more. The central government should be out there dramatically increasing the rural employment guarantee, creating an urban employment guarantee, providing food to everyone, and so on and so forth. All of the things that need to be done right now, providing income support to people for these 3 months, all of that it needs to be doing. Then we talk about how we build different structures of how we organize our economy through solidarity. But to assume that solidarity will get us out of this mess, I'm sorry, it won't. It's a necessary condition, but it's not the only necessary condition.
One of the biggest criticisms that has come in the recent past has been the centralization of CSR funds by PM Cares. Non-profits are on the ground, civil society members are on the ground offering aid and relief. And in the last 2-3 years, ever since the corporate social responsibility law came in, it's been one of the major sources of funding for the non-profit sector. With all of that money going in, absolutely nothing is available with civil society. How are there ways in which PM Cares could be disbursed, which could help put a balm on the current situation, even if not in the long term?
Well, in fact, precisely what you're saying. When you mentioned corruption a little while ago, I have to say the first thought that came into my head was PM Cares. Because what is the need for a fund that is separate, which is a private trust, which is itself a non-governmental organization, and which gets all these benefits and is audited separately, which is not even part of the central government audit? How can we even allow this? How can people's donations be diverted into that instead of into a PM relief fund, which is open and available and everything? If there is any trust to be restored, something like PM Cares, whatever amount has been received, which we have no idea, should be distributed among state governments to their relief funds in proportion to population. And this was, by the way, a proposal that was made by the meeting that I mentioned, the finance minister's meeting over the last 2 days. But right now, what do we have? We have an opaque private body headed by particular leaders who happen to be ministers and the prime minister, but are also members of a political party. We have absolutely no knowledge about how much money is going in there. We know that large amounts are going in there because everybody is either being coerced or arm twisted or persuaded to put the money into that rather than any other relief fund. And we have zero knowledge of how it's going to be spent. It's unbelievable that something like this, that a major catastrophe, a humanitarian calamity like this, can be used to, in a way, siphon off money that is intended to remedy the situation.
One of our viewers, Swami, is asking that, is it possible to develop a decentralized, deglobalized, rural-centric economy as a way out of this?
Absolutely. It is certainly possible, and it is also desirable. So let me put it this way, in an ideal world, in a world where we had a government that was responsive and thinking about it and accountable to the people, and where other countries also had such governments, a pandemic like this would make us rethink many things. It would make us rethink the pattern of growth we've had so far with its overemphasis on financial institutions that do not contribute to society. It would make us rethink patterns of global food consumption. Why is food that is, the primary product is produced in some country, it's taken across the world to be processed and then brought back to that same country to be consumed? Why? Why are we not emphasizing local seasonal produce that is produced in a sustainable, ecologically friendly way? Because it's more profitable for large companies to do it the other way. Why are we, why have we allowed everything to sort of go out of our hands? And this kind of rethinking should come back. The other big thing that should come back, absolutely decentralized and all of the things that you mentioned, but is the significance of care. So, the care services are the big underbelly of capitalism. They are really what enable economies to survive, societies to survive, and they subsidize global capitalism massively because so much of it is unpaid within the homes or underpaid. in society. The labor markets don't value care work. They get nothing, whether it's domestic work or it's nursing, or none of this actually is valued and properly remunerated by society. Now that we realize how important frontline care workers are, maybe this will make us rethink both the social value and the economic remuneration that we give to care.
When you say care services, would you also consider the unpaid labor that women give at home?
Yes, absolutely. But I'm not saying that, the unpaid labor should now quickly be paid, but I'm saying it should be recognized because it's a massive subsidy. And the women who do this, they should be eligible for pensions like everybody else. Venezuela, they gave that. They gave pensions for home workers, for example. They should be, valued. The work should be valued. It should be recognized. The hours spent should be recognized. And when you do that, the society actually then also rewards the paid care work more as well.
There's a question that's come in, I think, in response to your statement that we are depriving an entire generation on the future of education of children, especially girls who may now be put to work.
Yeah, I wish you wouldn't ask these really depressing questions because it's true. In India, I can see all kinds of bad things happening because families, when they're short of income, as it is, women in India were squeezed out of not just good jobs, but jobs. Yeah, the labor, we've had a fall of 9 million in employment over the before the pandemic. Yeah, and most of those were women. So women were already being squeezed out of jobs. Now they're even more likely to be squeezed out of jobs. And then when that becomes an issue, when their employment and earning capacities come down, then families will be even less inclined to educate them further. And so they will be reduced to unpaid work or very, very precarious, terrible work at very, very low rates. I hope that doesn't happen. But as I said, for that not to happen, what we really need is a very dramatic increase in public spending in all of these and in public employment, especially in the care services.
Is this also the best time to bring in universal basic income or qualified basic income?
I'm not a big fan of the universal basic income in general. Right now, there is absolutely no alternative. You're not allowing people to work. So you have to give people cash transfers. So right now, you have to give. I would say it is incumbent. It is not just a moral duty, but it's an economic duty of a government that will not allow you to work. They will have to give you some income compensation right now. So for the next 3 to 6 months, yes. But I personally believe that employment programs are much better, coupled with pensions for those who cannot work. So you give pensions to the elderly, you give pensions to those with disability, for those who cannot work for other reasons, single mothers looking after children, all of that. You provide pensions at half the minimum wage to all of those who cannot work, but you provide extensive employment, public employment, through both rural and urban employment guarantees of, I would say, 150 days per person, not per household. And use that employment to provide basic services and things that you need to regenerate agriculture, to do ecological, what is required to make greener towns and cities. There's a lot of work that can be done and is not done. And to provide care services. You can use all of that labor in many, many different ways.
My final question to you. It's near certain that we will have future waves of this pandemic and pandemic-like events in the future. What do you think can we do to prepare ourselves as a society given the current experiences? And how can we as citizens ask for a more justice and fair-oriented sort of government in these current times?
Wow, very, very big questions. So first, on the pandemic, look, we've had various kinds of sweeps of infectious disease, and certainly, I don't even know how long this one will go on for and so on, but we will experience significant waves of something or the other in future. Now, some people are saying, look, this is just the appetizer course for the main dish, which is climate change. which we seem to have forgotten about, but it hasn't gone away. And that is also one of those existential threats, if you like, to humanity, right? So, as I said, if it doesn't bring about those lessons in terms of how you manage societies and economies, those lessons in solidarity, those lessons in accountability, and those lessons that when it comes to crises like this, you need dramatic public intervention that is also forward-looking and forward-thinking, then we won't last very long, shall I say, as a species, if we don't take those lessons, okay? So let's hope we do take those lessons, not just for this and possible future pandemics, but also for the other very, very big existential threat that comes along. Your second question is related to that. How do you actually get governments or states to do that, to behave in those ways? And at the moment, it doesn't look very promising, right? It doesn't look as if we have governments that are, in that sense, accountable and responsive in many parts of the world. Not universally, but in many parts of the world. So again, here is, I think that's very, very important, especially for young people like you. I mean, we are living such a terrible mess, yeah. And we are, I say my generation, we are also, even when it comes to a pandemic, we prioritize this generation over yours, let's say, which is very, very unfortunate. It's also, I think, important for the young in particular to actually recognize that that democracy, you have to keep working for it. It doesn't just happen, and it's not because you have an election. And during an election, you can't get swayed by whatever is the thing of the moment. So I think one of the problems in India certainly has been that while we have a democracy, it's far too easily influenced by people who are able to sway perceptions by whatever they choose to use at the moment. And so we need a much more aware citizenry. And especially the young, I think, they have to be much more aware, and they have to put in much more work to keep it a democracy and to generate the states that will be accountable.
On that note, thank you so much for joining us, speaking to us. Thank you, Martha, for translating, and thank you to the viewers to sort of come and listen to us. Please leave your comments on the social platforms that you're in. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Martha, and thank you, Rishabh.